In the beginning, when God spoke, as God's Spirit was hovering over the chaos, God took these unexpected or unanticipated elements that existed in creation, and He spoke a word and created everything that we see today. Everything we can imagine, everything we can measure and taste and touch and see, God's power, His Spirit, as it was hovering over the waters, brought it into existence. And when God steps back and He sees what God has done, He says to Himself, "This is good." He says it over and over and over again in Genesis. And then, as he brings us into the center stage of the story, He looks back at everything else He's created, and in comparison, He says, "You and I are very good." This didn't mean a lot to me. I should say it didn't mean as much to me until I discovered or came to know in a deep way how significant this was for slaves living in Babylonian culture, which are probably the people who first received the story of Genesis. They looked around and they saw statues to all of the Babylonian gods. And in Babylonian culture, they believed that if a statue bore the name of God, it also bore the Spirit of God. So in Genesis 1 and 2, when it says, "Let us make humankind in our image and likeness," this is royalty language. Men and women equally reflect God. It's not that there's one king that we have to go through to get to God. It's not that God is interested in playing by the systems of the power brokers, but kingship gets democratized. Every person whose heart beats bears the image of God. We have the name of God that in many Jewish circles today is not pronounced. If you could bring this up here. I put this, Jews read right to left. If you read too much stuff, it'll mess you up. Go to the next one, please. This is the name of God that is not pronounced in most Jewish contexts. 4 letters compose the name of God. And a rabbi taught me one time, he said, we like to intellectualize these teachings in Jewish and Christian faith, especially as Americans, where it's always about propositional truth and what you can write down on an index card. But he said, do you know that humans literally bear the name of God in their body? And I had no idea what he meant. So this is how he taught us. In fact, let's just go ahead and do this. Everybody stand up real quick. I want you to find someone next to you or right behind you. You just need one person. What you're going to, go ahead and leave that up if you could. You're going to trace the name of God and watch how it fits the human body. Okay, now this first letter forms the face. Some of you just got really peculiar ideas that I'm not even going to talk about here. Okay, we're going to do air guitar now. You're going to do an air trace. The first letter forms the face. So with the person next to you, say, "You bear the image of God," and form that. If this was enlarged, it would look like our number 7 in the American counting system. So go ahead and trace over the person next to you the face and say, "You bear the name of God," this first letter. Now, watch how this works. The second letter. Can I do this? Come here real quick. What's your name? What's your name? Joseph. All right. Joseph's a good-looking guy, too, so this is going to work really well. All right. Joseph, you bear the name of God. The second letter forms the shoulders and the arms. Right? The third letter forms the core or the midsection. The fourth letter forms the waist and the legs. So when Genesis says that you bear the image of God, what it's saying is every person literally bears the image of God on their body. Go ahead and speak that word to the other person who didn't get to. Say that to each other. You bear the image of God on your body. Thank you. Okay, you can be seated. So God speaks and creation is called good, he speaks humanity is called very good because we are created in his image. And whether you are Muslim or Buddhist or Baha'i or Christian, white, black, Hispanic, whether you are from a red state or a blue state or no state, every person in this room bears the image of God. How would that change so many of our conversations if we really believe that? How would it change the internet sites that we browse if we really believed that was true? And when God spoke that truth into existence, God was inviting you to participate in God's life. In Genesis 6 and 7 and 8, when we see this incredible destruction and chaos because God has changed his mind, it's not as good as he thought it was. He puts this rainbow in the sky to say, I have all authority and power, and I always judge in order to redeem. I don't punish just for the sake of punishment. I punish in order to change. I punish in order to write a better story. When he calls Abraham out of Ur was the New York City of its day. When he calls Abram to go to a place he's never been for a purpose he's not sure of, for a period of time that's uncertain, he's saying to Abram, I'm calling you away from the center of power. I'm calling you away from the center of the known world because I am doing a new thing. When God called Abram, he was telling the world, I feed you, you don't feed me. You can go to Ur today and you can see, we don't call it Ur, but you can see this giant statue that was dedicated to the gods of that day where the people thought that humanity's primary responsibility was to feed God. We had to appease the gods. What God is saying to the Abraham story as he asks him to sacrifice his son is, I do the providing here. As Christians, we lean into that foreshadow of the significance of Jesus. When God speaks that truth, he's inviting you to be a part of his story. When he calls his people out of captivity and he calls Pharaoh for the way that he is allowing injustice and racism and persecution to endure, when he speaks that word through his prophets, he's inviting you and I into a better story. When he invites Moses to the mountain and he gives the people the 10 Commandments, he's inviting them to a better story. It's not the place where all of Israel gets the rules. It's the place where they get the dance steps to live no longer as slaves, but as men and women who are free in the big world God had already created. Leviticus is about dancing in God's world. If you will keep this, 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 and this, if you'll do this, and oh yeah, if you'll do this, then you will have the moral imagination and the courage to do what Leviticus 19:18 says, love your neighbor as yourself. Or the bar gets raised even higher a few verses later when Leviticus says, love the alien as you love yourself. Love the stranger as much as you love yourself. That will become a bedrock teaching in the life, in the ministry of Jesus. When God embodied that truth into the world, when he spoke that word, he was inviting you to be a part of a better story. In Joshua 1 through 5, if you're a person who wrestles with faith and doubt, as I have at many points in my journey, Joshua is one of the places you've got to camp out, no pun intended, but you've got to wrestle with some of the things that are said in Joshua. One of the things we miss about the wall of Jericho and about the way Rahab's used and all of the different parts of the story in Joshua, one of the things that we miss about God, especially as Gentiles who've been engrafted into this larger story that was never about us in the first place, one of the things that we forget is that oftentimes in Scripture, God will fight against you in order to fight for you. He has proved that over and over again. When God spoke that into the world, he was inviting you to a better story to live by. When he stepped in and spoke through the prophets of Amos and Ezekiel and Isaiah and Jeremiah, he was inviting you to a better story. When he spoke through the poets of the Psalms and the Song of Songs, when he spoke through the philosophers in Ecclesiastes, he was inviting you to a better song. But nowhere in the story did God speak more definitively than when he stepped in to the person of Jesus. And this is the thing that holds Christian faith together. Christian faith does not say that Jesus is like God. Christian faith says God is like Jesus. And if it can't be said of Jesus, it can't be said of God. So we look back at the messiness of the Hebrew Scriptures, and we can now read through the lens of Jesus to see how God deals with injustice, how God deals with the powers and the sin and the shame and the brokenness of our lives. If it can't be said of Jesus, it can no longer be said of God. That's the scandal of the Christian faith. I have a piece of graffiti that I keep in my office. It's from the 3rd century. It's called the Alexamenos Graffitio. It's the first example of urban tagging that we have in sophisticated culture. And the picture is of a man hanging on a cross who is half donkey, half man, with another man, a good, upstanding Greco-Roman citizen, pointing at the cross in worship. And the title in the graffiti says, "Alex worships his God." It's satire. It's The Simpsons. What they said about early Christians is something that we forget. They were saying that Christians literally worship an ass. If it can't be said about Jesus, it can't be said about God. And in his life, in his teachings, in his parables, in his death, in his resurrection, God has definitively invited you into a story that's better than any other story being sold. So we'd better pay attention to the stories that we're living by. We better pay attention to the stories that are shaping our identity, our understanding of sexuality and marriage and vocation, because those stories often are bankrupt in light of the big story that God is crafting in Scripture. I recently heard one of the best preachers in North America over the last 100 years. He told this story. He's at the very end of his life. And it brought this whole thing together of how God has been writing this big story. He said, when I was a young minister, my wife and I took vacation to Knoxville, Tennessee, which should make you question why I would give someone credibility who would start with a story in that way. But he said we had been living in Oklahoma, and when you've been living in Oklahoma, Knoxville, Tennessee looks like Maui. So we're in Knoxville, Tennessee with the Smoky Mountains out in front of us. We're in a restaurant, and this older man walks up to us, and he says, "Are you from here?" No, we're not from here. We're on vacation. What are you doing vacation? We're from Oklahoma. This is vacation for us. He said, "Can I tell you a story?" He says, "Well, we're on vacation. I just want to be with my wife." And he says, "What do you do for a living?" He said, "I'm a minister." He said, "Let me tell you a story." He said, "You see those mountains that you've been staring at for the last 30 minutes? I was born in those mountains. And when I was born, my mother was not married. And in that day and time, such shame was brought to a family in which there was an illegitimate child." One of maybe the worst phrases we have in American society. A phrase that was probably used, as we talked about Mary just a little while ago, a phrase that was probably used for Jesus, and who knows what language was used for his mother. He said, in those days, there was so much shame. I hid. I was invisible. I was on the margins. He said, when I got a little older, I got the courage. I heard that there was this great, big, booming voice of a preacher at one of the local churches, so I would sneak in late and get out early. You know how college students do church. I would go right after communion and then sneak out before the announcements. And he said, one time, though, I got stuck. One time I got caught in the traffic, and as I was trying to sneak out, I looked up, and all I could see was this big beard. It was the preacher, and I thought to myself, oh no. The preacher stooped down and looked him right in the eyes, this young boy, and he said, hey, I know who you are. You're a child of God. Now go and claim your inheritance." And that young boy said to this preacher, almost 70 years later, he said, "I was born that day." And the minister, with a big tear falling down his cheek, said, "I know who you are." And the man across the table said, "What do you mean you know?" He said, "I remember my father telling me about the state of Tennessee 3 times electing an illegitimate governor. Your name is Ben Hooper." See, when God invites you into a story, here's what God knows. We're going to try to find every possible way to avoid God. And for all the ways that we have learned to hide from God, in all of our scheming, in all of our deception, in all of the games that we play, in all of the intellectual hoops that we create that we think God can't get through, for all the ways that we hide from God, those are as many ways as God pursues us. If you listen to an artist, if you listen to a musician, if you listen to a writer, if you listen to someone who sees the sacred connection between their vocation and the Spirit of God at work in the world, which many of you get to experience in studying at a school like this, you start to believe that God plays in 10,000 places. There is nowhere that God is not. And you can't hide from God. It's the bad news and the good news. I think this video captures this, because I think what God is doing in every possible facet of life is He is inviting you to deep joy, and the only possible response is to learn how to dance in God's kingdom. Watch this video.